Melbourne's positive alternative, 89.9 Light FM. You're in conversation with Clayton, and this coming Wednesday is World Day Against the Death Penalty. It is also a day where a specific film is being screened called Guilty. This is about the final 72 hours of the Bali Nine's Myuran Sukumaran, one of those people who was heavily involved in Myuran's life in the last few years was Reverend Christie Buckingham. We've talked to her before. Was the spiritual advisor to Myu. Christie, wonderful to have a chat to you once again.
Lovely to be with you, Clayton.
Also on the line joining us is the president of Reprieve Australia. He was one of Myuran's lawyers at the time as well. Julian McMahon joins us. Julian, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me. Hi, Christy.
Hi, Julian.
Julian, we might start with you. Could you perhaps explain to us what Reprieve Australia actually is?
Sure. So it's a small NGO with the single purpose of abolishing the death penalty. So the advantage of being single purpose is, of course, that if people are interested in that single issue, it doesn't matter about their views on anything else. So that works well for us. The death penalty is one of those human rights issues where there's a long story of good news, whereas most of the world executed, say, 70 years ago at the end of the Second World War. Today, only 20-odd countries execute on any regular basis. So that's a big change in 2 generations.
Yeah.
And we're part of that story, and we hope to fight the death penalty in the remaining countries where people still are executed and hopefully bring about an end to it everywhere.
Yeah. Julian, for you, is this something that was always an innate part of who you were and your upbringing? I know that in terms of your professional experience, you've dealt with Australians around the world who have had to face the death penalty. Is that where the incredible heart and passion to make an organisation such single issue in this form came from, or was it always a part of who you were? No,
it was actually an accident. I mean, I was educated in a framework of looking after, using your skills or whatever to look after people who needed or help, one way or another. That's kind of outlook on life. So that was a privilege that I had. And then as a barrister, unexpectedly one day as a junior barrister, a Vietnamese family came to see me. And that was the family of Van Nguyen, who had been arrested in Singapore in December 2002. As a result of them coming to see me, I got involved in that case, which was a death penalty case. And suddenly, unexpectedly, I had to think a lot about it. And the rest has just been part of that fate.
Yeah. Yeah. Christie, for you, and we have had a chat on this program a few times, but maybe for those who didn't have the opportunity to hear that moment there, take us through a little bit of your involvement and how you came to meet Myu as well.
Well, not dissimilar to Julian, I was in Bali working on other projects over there and have been for some time. And we were invited by a girl that I actually went to college with, Gail Dewegi, to go into the prison, as they'd had a ministry into the prison for 17 years. And originally I was kind of reluctant because we had managed to get a couple of days just for Rob and myself. But the words of Jesus in Matthew 25, I was in prison and you visited me, just kept ringing in my head. And I thought, well, this is something we should do. So we went in to visit Myu and Andrew. It was actually Andrew's request that we go in at the time because Gail had told him that we were there. And that basically, we met Andrew and spent a lot of time with Andrew and spent a brief time with Myu. And I said to both of them, look, if there's anything that I can do to help, just let me know. And within 2 weeks, they had both given me lists of where they thought we could assist.
And I know that the incredible charge for you too, Christie, is that there wasn't just those lists at the time then, but even still now and the fighting that you are doing is a part of a promise to them as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. The boys were very clever. They knew who they could get to do what tasks, and were still delivering their instructions right up till the very, very end. And they said Mayu, basically, in the January I had a visit, and he said to me, if this goes the wrong way, would you be prepared to speak out with the death penalty? And would you vow to speak out for the death penalty, was his word. And I thought that was such a strange word for a young man. And I said, well, that's a very big, I remember exactly where he asked me it. And I said, well, that's a very big request. And I said, let me think about it. And he said to me, just with his face, he just sort of looked over his shoulder and kind of said to me, well, you haven't done too bad on your other two vows. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, how long have you been in the ministry? And at that stage, it was about 25, 26 years. And he said, how long have you been married? And I said, 23. He said, well, you can give me another 20 years on the death penalty. And I said, well, let me think about it. And then when I went back in the March, just before they were transferred, he said to me, have you thought about that? And I said, yes, I have. And he said, good. He said, what would your answer be? And I said, yes, I would do it. But in the whole scheme of things, there was other people that were prepared to do it, and that he had also spoken to about doing it. So, there wasn't this, it was this sense of, if I end up being the one to do it, then I'm prepared to, to speak out. And I would have spoken out regardless of whether I had have been there at the end or not.
Yeah. Julian, I suppose a question needs to be asked very much from, an unemotional aspect as people look into this and say, well, you said the idea is to try and stop these 20 or so countries from execution. What's a screening of a film for one day around the country going to do that in Australia that's going to impact the rest of the world? What is the answer to that question?
Well, I guess there are several answers. There's an international answer and a local answer. We'll start local. Every important issue, let's call it civic duties, understanding democracy, understanding the role of different groups in society, the right of women to vote, the right not to exploit children in labour, all those kinds of issues are fights that have been had at different times. But if we don't continually educate the next generation, the importance of those fights and the lessons learned will get forgotten. And human rights and the death penalty in particular in this conversation is one of those issues. You have to keep educating each generation as to why it matters that the state doesn't go and kill people, or, if you like, why it matters that everyone has the vote and so on. And so having the films showing around Australia is a way of continuing public awareness, discussion and education of one of many important issues. And internationally, we have to remember that there are a lot of people in countries where human rights are not taken for granted and where people do get executed by the state, either as a result of a court process or just on the street and so on. And the people like us, like you as a media person, Christie as a religious person, me as a lawyer, people like us who are fighting or arguing for a better society are often under enormous pressure. And so being able to see what happens in free countries is a valuable aid to them, is a beacon to look to the free world and see, well, how can we have these discussions and arguments, and how can we teach the next generation in a way which is worthwhile. And so when we do good things like that in a free country, it's a way of, and we'll market it and we'll still tell people around the world what we're doing. It's a way of giving hope and confidence to people who are much less privileged than we are to see how these things can be done.
The lawyer and the pastor, the spiritual advisor to the Bali Nine, joining me this evening, Christie Buckingham, Julian McMahon, ahead of this film this coming Wednesday, just this once-off screening happening around Australia, including here in Melbourne, called Guilty. We're going to be back talking a little bit more about the film in just a couple of minutes' time here on Light FM.
In Conversation with Clayton.
Melbourne's Positive Alternative, 89.9 Light FM, in conversation with Clayton. And Christie Buckingham was the spiritual advisor to one of the Bali Nine, Myuran Sukumaran, and also Julian McMahon, lawyer for members of the Bali Nine, as we've been hearing just a couple of moments ago. But if you weren't listening just then, you've just joined us. They're talking to me ahead of the World Day Against the Death Penalty this coming Wednesday, and that is also the day of the filming. It's just a once-off filming around the country, including here in Melbourne, of the film Guilty. Christie, maybe you could take us through a little bit more about what this film is about, and I suppose the emotion for you of being a part of this film and the creation of it, and also being able to share this with so many more this week.
Yeah, look, I think, Clayton, it would be remiss of me not to note that the 10th of October, this screening has actually been, not only is it the World Day Against the Death Penalty, but it also coincides with the government's efforts to negotiate a resolution on the moratorium at the United Nations Human Rights Council. And so I've been saying to people, this is an opportunity to let your voice be heard in a potentially historic moment, to speak up to those 23 countries that executed last year, and to show people that this is an important issue, that this is, and we have a moment in history that we can be part of. So to me, it's not just a screening of a movie; it's a very important dot in the landscape of the whole thing in relation to the abolition of the death penalty. And I think anyone that is interested in it should be there. Second thing is the movie itself. Look, I have seen it once completely through, and it's still very hard for me to watch. Even seeing the trailer, even going into some of the radio stations that I went into when the boys were still alive, is incredibly difficult, because there's not a day that goes by that I don't think about those boys, and that I don't think about what they could be doing in the war against drugs if they were alive. So the film itself as well brings us to the point where we have to consider, is anyone past redemption, or is it possible that through care, people like Julian, the lawyers, many, many good Christian people before me had been involved with the boys, had shown them there was options, had shown them, that they could come over to the light side. There is always a second chance. And, if we don't believe that as Christians, then we've lost the fundamental essence of, the sacrifice of Christ.
And I think this is one of the things that I know, Christie, you and I have talked on this program before about the remarkable change that had happened in these boys, and the incredible work that they were doing as they were going forward as well. Julian, as somebody might come along and watch this film, or even just be reflecting about this death penalty that is still occurring in 20-plus countries around the world, what would you say to us as listeners of you've been involved heavily with people as their lawyers, you've been hearing it, you're incredibly passionate about it. What's the spur, what's the encouragement, what's the challenge that I suppose you're putting to each of us?
Well, my answer might sound a bit highfalutin, but I do think it's the right answer. When we look at dozens of countries around the world where there's enormous tensions and trouble and development of, say, authoritarian governments and so on, one of the things that is consistent in many of those countries is a population that hasn't said enough and done enough and stood up enough in difficult conversations. And so we as a nation and other nations like ourselves, we need to continually debate, consider and argue difficult issues so that the whole community is able to regularly develop and make good decisions about how the nation works. And I think this death penalty debate is just one of those issues, and there are many others. We could talk about homelessness or treatment of prisoners, or even more fundamental, not more fundamental, but things like housing prices and access. All those kind of things are issues that we need to talk about regularly. Otherwise, good societies go backwards. Nothing remains stagnant. You're either going forwards or backwards. And so I think the death penalty debate is a very important issue to understand issues like justice, corruption, torture, fairness, to break that the difference in how countries are governed between the judiciary and parliament and so on. And so I know that's not the answer that everyone's expecting, but it's one of the reasons why it's important to do these kind of things, even though it's not a day-to-day issue and even though nobody in this country is getting executed.
A question for both of you as we wrap up. Both of you were on the island when the boys were executed. It was something that I'm imagining and can only imagine is horrific on one hand and a privileged position in the other. How are you 2.5 years on from that? I suppose emotionally coping with that. You're obviously very determined, both of you, to be ensuring you're talking about this. Is it something that still affects you in an emotional way? And I suppose, what have you had to put around yourself to cope with that? Maybe we start with you, Christie.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no question. For me, it has been really just getting into the work in whatever way I can of keeping my promise, keeping my vow to the boys. There are times that are harder than others, especially when, I guess when you've been involved in something like this, other things seem so trivial, and yet you've got to be with people in trivial moments. In fact, even just as a pastor, there was a while where people find it difficult to relate to me afterwards because they felt, well, what are my problems like concerned to that? Or the opposite, why have you been spending time with people like this when you could have been helping us? And, my answer to that is that everyone deserves a second chance. So it's been a really big and continual adjustment for me, and basically just being around people who have also experienced it and been able to give some really concrete advice has been helpful.
Yeah, Julian, what about for yourself? It's part of the job of a lawyer to be there for their client all the way through, wherever it might be, but that's got to take an emotional toll. How have you ensured that you've kept stable as you've gone forward?
Well, what I've realised over the last couple of years is that everyone who is involved, and by everyone I mean, say, approximately 20 people who were closely involved. That's people on the religious side, the legal side, the diplomatic side, and of course the families of the boys, most of all. The people who were most involved were pretty obviously wounded, is the word that I've landed on after all this time. People talk about a range of things like, depression or stress or, things that happen as a result of these kind of things. But I think everyone was wounded. And when I hear people like Christie or other people involved talk about how it played out for them, it always seems to come within that word from the way I hear it. And so I would say I, like the others, were just, we were all just psychologically wounded to be part of such a process, which ultimately was, there was a fundamental injustice about killing the boys. So we were involved in trying to save two young men who'd become two fine young men and who were helping lots of other needy, disadvantaged prisoners. And we saw them doing that. So it's like being in a closed world of 1,000 people, seeing two outstanding leaders lead day and night with hard work and leadership, and then see them plucked out and killed. And it's deeply confronting. And we all cared very much about them because we were with them for so many years. But then, I don't know, you don't want me to ramble on radio. I often also say in a conversation like this, Clayton, that even though it's hard for lawyers to deal with a situation like that, there are many other lives which are even all around us, which are so much harder. We went in and it was out, finished and we're out, and now we're moving on in all kinds of ways. But when you think about, as I often do, one of my brother has a severely disabled child, and who's 20 now, but it's 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, and and he loves the kid and so on, but it's such a hard job to look after, say, a parent with dementia or a disabled child and so on, or maybe a partner who's had a stroke or whatever. Those things are much harder than what we were doing, even though ours was dramatic and intense. I actually think it takes a lot more courage, and it's a lot harder to do that relatively thankless slog week after month after year.
Julian, we thank you so much for being vulnerable and talking about your experiences, and we wish you all the best with Reprieve Australia, not just the best with that, but outcomes from that there would actually be this death penalty around the world not enforced in any country as we go forward. We thank you for your time today. Thanks so much for having a chat to us.
Thanks, Clayton. Thanks for having me.
Christie, we thank you for, once again, another opportunity to chat to us. We have so appreciated your willingness to be honest and vulnerable as well, and we thank you again for you sharing your time tonight.
Thank you.
And we wish you both all the best for this film, Guilty. It's just a once-only screening. It's on this World Day Against the Death Penalty this coming Wednesday. There's a few different places around town that this is being screened, and we wish you all the best with that and the impact of that as well. Both of you, once again, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.